My name is David Gallo. I'm the director of the AIFC Academy of Law. We'd like to welcome all of you who are calling in from literally around the world to participate in this learning and development event. We are very pleased at the Academy of Law to enable our stakeholders, students, lawyers, barristers, and so forth to continue the professional development activities through webinars such as this. We appreciate your time and your patience. And first and foremost, we hope you're staying safe and productive. Well, today we have a very exciting webinar with a phenomenally talented speaker who I will introduce momentarily. Before we get into that, just a couple of housekeeping matters. This session will last anywhere between an hour and 1.5 hours. Today's featured lecturer will be presenting slides, and he will be soliciting your questions throughout the presentation. You can ask questions in one of two ways. One is go on the chat function, which you'll see on as an icon on your screen, and you can ask Professor Van de Putte directly a question in writing, and when he comes to the Q&A time at the end of that slide, he will go ahead and read your question. So you can write your question and he will read it and then answer it. Or you should have a hand icon on the right side of your screen if you want to ask a question orally so that we can hear you. Press that icon. When Professor Van de Putte is ready, he'll call upon you and you can ask your question orally. Okay, so the title of today's webinar, the topic is the AIFC Corporate Governance Principles. Well, this is an incredibly important subject, especially when it comes to doing international business like that which is conducted within the AIFC. The focus is on developing and maintaining and adhering to international best practices when it comes to corporate governance. There's typically a legal aspect to it because these governance principles are sometimes codified into policies that corporate officers and managers and directors are required to follow from a legal standpoint. And then in addition to that, there are various statutory matters that require compliance among senior managers, risk managers, and so forth. And Professor Van de Putte will get into more detail around that entire topic. So just by way of overview, at the AIFC in September of 2019, work began on the development of the AIFC Corporate Governance Principles with assistance from TheCityUK and from the Chartered Governance Institute, as well as various advisors and consultants. These principles, these governance principles, and the associated guidance, this is with a capital G, the guidance, it's an official written document, are designed to improve the capabilities and to influence the mindsets of boards and individual directors, and to contribute to the sustainable long-term success of companies in Kazakhstan. During today's session, we will explore the evolution of corporate governance around the world, the principal tenets of corporate governance, the 13 AIFC corporate governance principles, and especially their applicability, and the training programs that we have developed at the AIFC around this entire topic. The speaker's bona fides go on and on. His credentials speak for themselves. I'd like to point out in particular today that at the AIFC, Professor Dr. Alexander Van de Putte is the chairman of corporate governance and stewardship, and he's also the chairman of the academic council of our very own Academy of Law. And with that, let me turn the floor over to Professor Alexander Van de Putte. Alexander.
David, thank you so much. Good morning, London. There are a lot of people from London that are calling in, and good afternoon, Nur Sultan. Today, I will try to give an overview of what we're trying to do with corporate governance in Kazakhstan, and I will, more particularly at the AIFC, but it's not limited just to the AIFC. Now, if we look at the AIFC, what is our mission? And maybe I should start with what our mission is. Our mission is we want to contribute to the sustainable economic development of Kazakhstan and the region by fostering innovative financial products and services. So our aim is really to focus on the economic development. And from the very beginning, we said that corporate governance has to be aligned with that mission, especially at the AIFC. Another thing that is important to mention is that the AIFC is a new initiative, and most of the companies that are registered with us would typically not be required to apply a code, corporate governance code. They're way too small, and they're not of the level of complexity, at least currently, that would require a compliance and a policing mindset. Instead, what we need to do is actually, we need to change mindsets, and we need to help company directors add tangible value to the companies for which they are working. A third important aspect is entrepreneurship. If we look at small and medium-sized enterprises in Kazakhstan, for example, they contribute, roughly speaking, to about 25 to 28% of the economy. If we look at OECD countries, it is actually a much bigger share. It typically hovers around 65%. So given that we want to focus on stimulating entrepreneurship and the private sector, especially in Kazakhstan, we wanted to have a corporate governance set of principles that would help company boards steer the company towards their long-term success, grow in complexity, and actually allow them to expand the size of the pie, so to speak, and also make sure that various stakeholders can actually get a fair slice of the pie. So with that said, I propose as an agenda to give a little bit of background. I'm also going to talk a little bit about my own research that I'm doing in corporate governance, and more specifically, what I refer to as corporate governance 4.0. That has nothing to do or limited to do with the fourth industrial revolution, but it has to do much more with sustainability. And then I will talk about the principles and their philosophy. Then we're going to talk about training and certification, and then finally the journey ahead. So let me start with background. And if for one reason or another you don't hear me or you don't see anything that I'm showing, just raise your hand or drop me a note in chat. I have my chat box open, and also I will be looking at the chat box. So let's first have a look at a short history of corporate governance. And this is really based on my own research that I'm doing right now, or that I started about 18 months ago. And the first part is really about corporate governance what I call corporate governance 1.0. And that started in the United States. It didn't start in Europe or the United Kingdom, but it really started in the United States. And what we saw, and you probably have heard about Boone Pickens, is a man who recently passed away, and you can refer to him as the Raider of the Lost Ark. He was all about hostile takeovers. And what happened then is that companies put in place a number of defensive-driven governance principles, such as anti-takeover charter amendments and so on. So the focus really there was to focus on hostile takeover defenses. Now, then came the corporate scandals. And I list here 3, Enron, WorldCom, and Maxwell, but there were many, many more. In Italy, for example, there was Parmalat. In the Netherlands, there was Ahold, and there are many more that you can probably think of. And compliance driven governance was really started in the 1990s, and we saw then Sarbanes-Oxley in the US and the Cadbury report in the United Kingdom. And the focus was really on preventing fraudulent failure. What is also important is that most of the corporate governance eras were very reactive. So corporate governance era was really about preventing fraudulent failure after a number of scandals happened. So what we saw is not only in the United States, but also in the UK and most Commonwealth nations. And we also saw it in many of the continental European countries. Then what happened was the global financial economic crisis. And I will talk about that in a minute. Now, some people would ask me, well, could this have been anticipated, the global financial economic crisis? Well, just as an anecdote, we did. And we were not the only ones. And when I say we did, I was at the time head of global practices at the World Economic Forum. One of our practices was the Global Risk Report. And I remember that in January 2007, this was at the annual meeting in Davos, I was facilitating a panel. And on that panel were 4 American economists, including 3 Nobel Prize winners. And they said, a global financial economic crisis is already starting right now. And by the way, you can still do something about it. Who was sitting in the room? Almost right in front of us was the chief executive of Lehman Brothers. 18 months later, Lehman Brothers was bankrupt. Now, what was the problem? The problem was that externalities were not internalized. So, and then what emerged was what I would call increasingly foresight-driven governance. Now, the global financial economic crisis, if you compare to the current crisis, was deep and very narrow. The current crisis is much wider and also much deeper. What happened in the US, Dodd-Frank, and in the United Kingdom, the Walker Report. Why do I talk about the Walker Report? Because the Walker Report specifically focused on the financial services sector. And the recommendation in the Walker Report was that financial service sector companies should have a separate risk committee that takes into account forward-looking risks. Not just risks as part of the audit committee, which is typically backwards-looking, but also forward-looking risk. And when I saw that as a professor of strategic foresight, I was really excited about this because a lot of value can potentially be destroyed because we don't take into account the new realities. And that typically the new realities are in the outside environment, the externalities, so to speak. The focus then increasingly became on the right balance between conformance and performance. Not just conformance, but also performance. And so is that enough? Well, probably not, but that I have currently shaded. I will talk about that in a minute. But if we look at the United States, largely, I would say, didn't leapfrog in that field in embedding foresight-driven governance as part of its corporate governance principles. Well, they don't use principles, in fact. They use a code which is not principles-based. However, the UK and most Commonwealth nations have done so to a large degree. And we also seen that in most continental European countries. Now, on the next slide, I want just to give you an idea about the value destruction in the financial services sector because people were blindsided. So this is the market capitalization of global banks in 2007. And I hope you're all sitting down because this is going to be quite a shock. Fast forward 2009. This is the market capitalization of the same banks. Well, of course, there are a few banks that are not there anymore, including Lehman Brothers. Shall I do that again? So this was 2007. This was 2009. And the key is, it could have all been avoided. Now, let me then talk about what is currently emerging. And this is corporate governance 4.0. And this is where my research is actually focusing on. And that's what I would refer to as sustainability-driven governance. That started around 2016. And that followed the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, but also the 2016 Paris Agreement, of which, by the way, Kazakhstan is a signatory. So we now have to come up with very concrete plans in order how we're going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the objectives as set forth in the 2016 Paris Agreement. Now, here I refer to two codes. And note that the United Kingdom code, the UK code, is not there. In the latest 2018 iteration of the UK code, there's a reference to sustainable long-term success. There is. But that's about all that is reflected in the report. On the other hand, in South Africa, the King IV code and also the Dutch code, just to cite a few examples, heavily emphasize the importance of sustainability as part of corporate governance, including integrated reporting that requires companies to report on all 5 capital stocks. And what are the capital stocks? It's not just the financial capital, it's also natural capital, human, social, manufactured, and of course, what is needed is financial capital as well. And I think this is going to be the way forward, especially in an environment that we are now with the global pandemic that has illustrated that in the end, our economies have not been that resilient. So how can we avert an even bigger shock? And that is global climate change. Just to give you an idea about the current cost of global climate change, it is $5 trillion to the global economy, or 6% of the global economy. And it's only growing. When Lord Stern came up with his own report, he estimated that the cost of global climate change, so this is about 20 years ago, that it was $800 billion. And now it's $5 trillion. So it's only growing. So we can passively wait, but if we don't passively wait, then we can potentially reduce the impact of it and potentially also turn it into an opportunity. We took that into account when we developed our own corporate governance principles. So to focus much more, not only on forward-looking, finding the right balance between conformance and performance, but also on the long-term sustainable success of companies. Since I left the World Economic Forum, I run my own survey. And I ask actually companies, and there are 6,200 respondents. They come from 10 industries. It includes OECD and BRIC countries, and BRICS with an S here, so it includes South Africa. And I've been running this for the past 12 years. And this has come back systematically, except for one factor that has only emerged in the last 3 years, and that's beyond profit. So what drives sustainable long-term success? First of all, companies that are successful over time, they have a deeply embedded and shared values that are a guide to action. So they're not only values, they're shared, they're deeply embedded, and they're a guide to action. So just think about it. Walk around in the company where you work and ask, what do we really stand for? What are our values? And how do you translate that day to day into action? Not many companies or not many employees in a company would be able to address that necessarily very positively. Beyond profit, as I mentioned, is something that only emerged over the past 3 years. And what companies are increasingly doing is they aim at growing all 5 and balancing, by the way, all 5 capital stocks. So what we typically do, or very often do, we extract natural capital with the objective to maximize financial capital, and very often that's in the short term. What if we could grow all 5 capital stocks simultaneously? There are many companies that do that. And if we believe the report that Amundi has recently released, actually last year, the returns on ESG compliant investments largely exceeds the returns of non-ESG compliant investments. So beyond profit, profit is important, but beyond profit is definitely something that we should aim in order to, well, not ensure, but at least contribute to the sustainable long-term success of the company. Number 3 is peripheral vision. Peripheral vision is about scanning for the weak signals that are typically in the periphery. As you see, I'm wearing glasses. So where do I look? I look through the glasses, but there's also the periphery. I know there's something there, but typically we don't look in the periphery. But it's not just about the periphery outside of the company, it's also the periphery inside of the company. Let me give an example. If we look at Volkswagen Dieselgate, I think 2 things happened there that created a huge crisis for the company at an enormous cost in excess of $30 billion US. And one is that probably they had a dual tier governance structure. So the board of directors was way too far to understand what was going on in the company. And number 2 is that even executive management was not scanning for weak signals within the company. And as a result, the wrong incentives combined with, well, cutting corners led to an enormous crisis, and actually that's a crisis created from within. Number 4 is companies that have sustainable long-term success have an experimental mindset at the edges of their market. Why do I mention this? Well, we're in the 4th Industrial Revolution, and it's not just the phenomena of the 4th Industrial Revolution, it also happened in the 3rd Industrial Revolution. I used to work for McKinsey and Pricewaterhouse, and I was actually in mergers and acquisitions. And what we saw, for example, in the 90s is that traditional pharma companies were disrupted by biotech companies, someone from outside of the industry. What we see is that now it's happening to the automotive industry. And both are quite capital intensive industries. So it's not just in tech companies, it's actually happening in capital intensive industries. Could this happen to traditional oil and gas companies? I can assure you it's already happening. So companies need to have an experimental mindset at the edges of their market. And that's in essence the role of the board to ensure all of these, including the last one, and that is being financially conservative. What does that mean? Is have the right capital and structure in place so that you grow, but that you grow solvently and sustainably. So they are financially conservative. That means that they have not too much debt in their capital structure. I used to work with Professor Tom Copeland, and he said to me, Alexander, keep the following in mind. When you have flexible assets, you can use inflexible financing and the other way around. So what is it? A flexible asset is one where you have low operating cost. Operating leverage. That means low fixed cost. And as a result, when you have low fixed cost, you have flexible assets and you can use more debt in your capital structure. So if you think about oil and gas companies, mining companies, companies that are active in semiconductors, very high fixed cost, they should have very low gearing in their capital structure. So these are some of the things that we need to take into account when we develop corporate governance principles, because otherwise we will not contribute to the sustainable long-term success of a company. Why corporate governance principles and not a code? I think before I refer to that, the AIFC, the almost 500 companies that we have registered, most of them are small. Even if you look at, let's say, the BCPD, which is the Bureau of Continuous Professional Development, which is a subsidiary of the AIFC authority, it's a relatively small company. So in a company like this, would we actually use a code? The answer is no. If you look at companies, let's say where do codes normally apply to? It's typically for large listed companies. It's not for smaller entities that are still growing in terms of scale and complexity. So we decided as a result to develop corporate governance principles. And these are really designed to promote sound corporate governance in any company of any size. I have my own company in Belgium. It's a very small company, maybe 250,000 pound turnover, but still I apply sound corporate governance principles, including stakeholder mapping. I have a risk register and so on. So those principles are not limited to the size of a company. Now, if we go then forward, let's look a little bit at the 6 months collaborative effort that we have navigated through over the past 5 to 6 months. First of all, I developed guidelines and the underlying philosophy, and I made that available to the working group members on the second half of September 2019. Then at the end of September, we had our first working group that was here in Nur Sultan. I was unfortunately not present, but Chris Campbell-Holt, who is the Chief Executive of our court and also its registrar, he chaired that working group meeting on behalf of the AIFC. And then we had our second working group, and that was in London. And that was on the 24th of October, 2019, followed by a third one, also in London. And then the final one took place via telephone conference call, because by that time, even Kazakhstan was in lockdown. And as a result, people couldn't travel anymore. It was initially scheduled for the 5th of March. Now, in the process, we involved all the AIFC staff and, well, not all the AIFC staff, but AIFC staff from all the bodies and organizations. And why? Because we wanted to make sure that whatever we come up with would be representative for everybody. And also within the context of Kazakhstan, of course, and that we are at different stages of economic development than, let's say, the United Kingdom or another developed country, let's say Singapore. I also consulted about 30 experts with diverse backgrounds. They're typically in my network. Personally, I have followed chartered qualifications in a number of countries that include South Africa, Singapore, the United States, United Kingdom, of course. And as a result, I have developed a big network, and I've consulted them. And they don't only come from developed, but also they come from developing countries. And that, I think, is very important, because the developing country context is so different from the developed country context. And then the CDir, and that was mentioned by David at the very beginning, assisted us, and the UK government financed actually the working group meetings. And we're very grateful for that. And the CDir actually published a report on it and it's available from the CityUK website. And then Simon Osborne, and Simon was the former Chief Executive of ICSA, Institute for Chartered Secretaries and Administrators. Now it's called the Chartered Governance Institute. He serves as our principal advisor throughout the project, and he continues to do so. And in fact, he is going to be on our advisory council, and I will talk a little bit more about that later on. And also is going to be on our advisory council is Dr. Carl George. He's also on our call here today. And there's going to be another person who's also on our call, but I haven't asked him yet. So as a result, I will keep my mouth shut until he has kindly accepted my invitation. So now let's have a look at the principles and their underlying philosophy. And I don't see any questions coming in, so I will continue. So first of all, if we look at the principal tenets of corporate governance, and this is universally around the world. This is not just in the United Kingdom or the US, but it's universally around the world. It's truly about three things, and they go hand in hand. First of all, it's about probity, honesty, and decency. And that's critical of any corporate governance principles or code. Number two is about transparency, or in other words, disclosure. And it's not just about disclosure about dealings and money, but it's also about disclosure about how decisions are made, whether boards are composed of largely independent directors, whether directors have any particular relationship with the executive management, whether they had worked primarily for that company, and so on. Accountability is obviously also very important. And the question is then, accountable to whom? Typically, one would say it's accountable to the shareholders. But I would say, no, I would say it's accountable to the long-term success of the company. And of course, that includes the shareholders, but it also includes a lot of other stakeholders. And we need to take those other stakeholders into account, and we potentially need to balance and manage all their interests. So it's about honesty, it's about transparency, it's about accountability. So what have we developed? We developed 13 principles. We grouped them under 7 sections. And if we look at directed duties, which is in the middle here, I think you can see my mouse in the middle here, then, and again, if you look around the world, you can put them under 2 broad categories, the fiduciary duty and the duty of skill and care. In the United Kingdom, there are currently 7 duties. But in most countries, including most Commonwealth countries, there are only 2 duties. But even the 7 that we have in the United Kingdom, they could be grouped under these broad categories, the fiduciary duty and the duty of skill and care. The 13 principles, that's the heading of the slide, are logically grouped under 7 sections. I will go through each of these sections in some detail later on. And the principles are also aligned with the AIFC mission. I will refer back to the AIFC mission in a minute. I believe it's even on the next slide. And why is that so important? Because we have a unique opportunity. And we believe that as a result, the principles need to be aligned with that opportunity in order to provide guidance to employees, but also to our diverse stakeholders. We then developed indeed, and David has referred to that as well, not only the principles, which was also published through the CityUK, but also a guidance document, and that guidance document has 47 guidance provisions. And this guidance document is used with various boards in order to help them implement sound corporate governance within their respective organization. And we're already working with 2 organizations with that regard. and they're both subsidiaries of the AIFC authority. So let's start with the principles then, and let me start with, well, it's called section 0. Actually it is. It may sound strange, but we thought, is that really a section on its own? And we said, no, let's have it as director duties in general. So what we have here is, and let me read the principle to you, and then we can potentially discuss it as well. So companies should be led by a board that promotes the long-term success of the company, generating values for its shareholders, but also acting responsibly towards key stakeholders. And here is, and this is where the link then is to our mission, and in the case of companies operating in Kazakhstan, also contributing to the sustainable economic development. So yes, we want to attract companies, foreign companies, to come and register with the AIFC through AFSA, Astana Financial Services Authority, but the objective should be, one, yes, to create value for their shareholders and their stakeholders, but also to contribute to the sustainable economic development of Kazakhstan and even the region. So that's principle number 1. And that's one that is linked to director duties. For your information, the guidance documents actually provides quite a bit of information about the 2 director duties. So that we look at, the fiduciary duty and the duty of skill and care. And what that would actually mean for their own organization, and how directors would be able to discharge their duties as well. And in training, we will use a number of case studies in order to illustrate how actually company directors would be able, within their own unique context, discharge their own duties. More about training in a while. So if we then go to section number 1, and section number 1 is about company purpose and board leadership. And here we have 3 principles. So let me again read them to you, and also maybe help provide an explanation of what we really mean with it. First of all, companies should have an effective board, which is collectively accountable for ensuring that the company is managed prudently and effectively. I think there are several things that stand out here. It's, first of all, directors also individually, but it's really important that the board is collectively accountable. And what does that mean? They need to really have a proper debate before they go to making a decision, in order to make sure that the various perspectives on a particular decision are brought to the fore, discussed, and also assessed by members of the board. That collective accountability is actually, I believe, of critical importance. But it's really about that the company is managed prudently and effectively. We will talk a little bit later about risk and risk appetite, and obviously this is going to link to risk and risk appetite as well. Principle number 3 is that the board should establish the company's mission, purpose, values, and strategy. It's not up to executive management to do that. In a unified board, of course, executive management is part of that, at least the chief executive, maybe also the CFO, and it's their collective responsibility to develop the mission, purpose, and values, and potentially strategy as well. At the AIFC BCPD, where I'm the chairman of the board, we developed our strategy collectively as a board. And also, we believe that it should satisfy itself that these and its culture are aligned. And that's not easy to do. Culture is probably referred to as the norms and behaviors that exist within a company. How do we make sure that the culture, what breathes in an organization, and the mission, vision, and values are really aligned? Many companies actually struggle with that. But it's something that the board needs to ensure that actually that is the case. And later on, we will a little bit talk about, well, it's actually principle number 4. The board should set, and its members should uphold high standards of ethical behavior. It's not just high standards of ethical behavior, it's also model this behavior within and outside of the organization and hold executive management accountable for delivering these standards throughout the organization. Separately, colleague of ours, Zirit Sedemek, working together with the Institute of Ethics in the United Kingdom, probably the premier institute in its field, has developed the AIFC Ethics Code. And this one is going to be approved by the governor, then also the AIFC Management Council, which is our higher level board. And already at the BCPD, we have adopted the ethics code. And we are appointing currently a number of ambassadors in order to not only adopt these standards, ethical standards, but also model its behavior within the organization. So that's principles that are linked to company purpose and board leadership. On the next slide here, we're talking about an additional principle that has to do with the division of responsibilities between executive management and the Nets. And the Nets are the non-executive directors. In large listed companies in the United Kingdom and in most Commonwealth nations, there should be a majority of independent non-executive directors on the board. Now, that will not always be the case for AIFC organizations because of their size and complexity. In the US, for example, I found there is a potential big issue with this one, because what we see is that very often that the president or the chairman of the board, as we refer to it in the United Kingdom, and the chief executive is very often the same person. I don't think that's a very good idea, because it also refers to the second part of this principle. So let me read the principle and then I'll come back to the second part. The board should ensure there's clear division of responsibility between the non-executive directors and executive management, and that no one individual has unfettered powers of decision-making. So if the chief executive and the chairman or the chairperson is the same person, then there's a big risk that that individual could actually have unfettered powers of decision-making with potential poor consequences. Just look at what happened with Boeing. And although the chief executive was stripped of his chairmanship before he was ousted, the new chief executive is also the president of the company, of the board of the company. So I don't think that's a good idea at all. Now, the question then is, what does independence really mean? Well, and the question is, could I be considered as independent? I've been now, 14 years in Kazakhstan. I've worked most of my time directly or indirectly with our current governor, Governor Kelimbetov. So strictly speaking, if we look at the letter of the word, the answer is no. But I'm the chairman of the board of the BCPD. So I asked them, the governor, said, well, do you consider me as independent? And he said, yes, because you're independent in character and in judgment. And if you look at the UK Corporate Governance Code, that's the way they define independence in part. It's not just that, but that's a big part of it. So ask yourself, as a non-executive director, and that should also be the chairperson, should ideally also be a non-executive director, are you independent in character and in judgment? will you always look at in terms of acting in the best interest of the company? It's never easy, especially given that I've been for a long period of time in Kazakhstan. And the key reason I'm still here, actually two key reasons, is the potential and the people. And that I'm part of a project, the AIFC, that actually could have transformational change on Kazakhstan and its impact actually on society. And I try to do that. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I always try to have independent judgment, make independent judgments. And I think that's what is required. Let's now look at board structure, composition, and skills. Two principles here. One is boards should be large enough to accommodate the necessary skill and competencies, but still be small enough to promote cohesion, flexibility, and effective participation. Research done by ICSA, the Charter Governance Institute, shows that the moment that boards become too large, they become ineffective. But on the other hand, if boards are too small, you probably don't have the proper challenge and discussions and debates that are needed in order to, well, for directors and the board collectively to discharge their duties. As you know, I'm a professor, and actually I'm a professor in a business school. And in a business school, teaching is very often different than in, let's say, an economic school. I don't want to criticize economic schools, but it's just the nature of the teaching that's going on. So in the course I teach, I have actually breakout groups. And what I've observed, and I've spoken to my colleagues at a variety of business schools around the world, I've observed that actually a group of about 7 people it is best in order to have proper discussions and at the same time bring in different perspectives, and that also at the same time nobody can really hide. If you have too large boards, then actually some people can actually hide behind the discussion and not really be part of that discussion. What's the right answer? Well, there's no single right answer, but obviously we need to make sure that we have the right balance of skills, and that's then principle number 7, experience, independence, and knowledge in order to make sure that we can make these proper decisions. Now, if we look at balance of skills, here we largely look at diversity. Should we have people with legal background? Yes. But should it be dominated by people with legal background? Definitely not. Should we have people with financial backgrounds and accounting background? Of course we have. But also we need to have, we need to bring in people with diverse perspectives. And that very often is driven by gender diversity and ethnic diversity. All that comes together in order to have thought diversity. And when you have thought diversity, you can make much better decisions. And there's a wide body of research that actually shows that if you have the board with the right structure and composition of skills, you make much better decisions. So this is a very important principle that we need to adhere to. And Dr. Carl George, who is on this call here as well, and Carl, if you turn on your video, then people will see you and they will already immediately notice that you are different, and that adds significant value to the discussion. Also, Dr. George has worked on training in 12 developing countries. And that brings interesting perspectives to the debate as well, because you can bring in these different perspectives from different countries too. Now we are at principle number 8, and here we look at the area number 4, which is audit, risk, internal control, and reporting. I said before that, well, the Walker report recommended that we would that we would have recommended that we would have a forward-looking risk committee. Now, audit, risk, internal control, and reporting is typically backwards looking. That doesn't mean we don't need to have it. We need to have it, right? And that's actually a key requirement. And for large companies, there should even be a independent, well, not an independent, there should be a audit committee, but it should be represented by independent directors. I believe it's at least 3. That's at least for large listed companies, and I refer in that case to the United Kingdom. So the board should ensure that the company's financial and other reports present an accurate, balanced, and understandable assessment of the company's financial position and prospects. So it's not just the financial position, but it's also prospects looking towards the future, by ensuring that there are effective internal risk control and reporting requirements. In Kazakhstan, for example, if we look at reporting requirements, narrative reporting is typically not required or used. But the real value is, I think, coming primarily from the narrative reporting. Reporting on, for example, the balance of skills that you have among the board members. It's reporting on whether the directors have truly discharged their duties. It's in the footnotes linked to the financial statements. Those are all very important aspects that we will try to promote in Kazakhstan to have much better reporting. I would even argue that for some companies, like the oil and gas and mining companies, but it's not limited to them, they should also have ESG reporting, and why not have integrated reporting that actually reports on the 5 or 6 capital stocks. So audit, risk, internal control, and reporting of critical importance, but it doesn't stop with backwards reporting. We should think about reporting in a way that is meaningful for stakeholders, including shareholders. Then, in terms of risk governance, the board collectively here should be responsible for setting the risk appetite of the company. Well, what does risk appetite mean? Well, it's obviously a relatively vague concept, but if we go to corporate finance and to corporate strategy, what is the first thing they would ever teach you? And that is, there's a fundamental relationship between risk and return. The higher the risk, the higher the expected return should be. So that relationship, unfortunately, exists. And that also means that we should not try to eliminate risk. Actually, in most cases, that will not be possible. But the board should set the risk appetite for the company. And that risk appetite obviously refers to the amount of risk that the company is willing to take with the objective to achieve its strategic objectives. Obviously, a startup will have a very different risk appetite than a large mature company, and a large mature company that is being disrupted will probably have a higher risk appetite than one that is not being challenged both from within and outside of the industry. But setting that risk appetite is a key role of the board, and that's why we have it as a separate category here. The board should also ensure that the company has a risk management, internal control, and compliance framework, which is effective, well-defined, and well integrated. So risk governance, critically important. We stopped short here about having a forward-looking risk committee, but in the guidance, we do refer to that for larger companies, especially financial institutions that are of a certain size. We're almost there, well, at least for the principles part. And now let's have a look at evaluation of board individual directors' performance. Employees in a company should, but one second, let me go back actually to the previous slide, this one. Some companies have actually created shadow boards. And what is a shadow board? A shadow board is not composed of non-executive directors. It's actually composed of non-executive employees in a company. Now, why is that important? Because if a company is going, let's say, to a digital transformation, and more companies are going through a digital transformation, it would be good, and it also relates to board structure, composition, and skills, it would be good to bring different perspectives in. My children are both Generation Z, and I can guarantee you that they have very different perspectives than me. It doesn't mean they have better or poorer perspectives than me. No, they have different perspectives. And my students, actually, most of them are millennials. And what they do, they actually challenge my mental model. And a shadow board is really about challenging the overall board mental model. And I think that should be part, especially in larger organizations, and those that are going through a transformation that requires new skills and attitudes and perceptions, that a shadow board should be created. Many companies, well, not many, quite a few companies, especially in tech areas, Nokia is one example, have already created shadow boards. And it allows them to much better navigate through the complex risk environment where traditional board members would not be very well versed in, because, well, they didn't grow up with the technologies and that were required in order to fully appreciate and understand them. So now, going to board evaluation and individual directors' performance. The board should ensure that there is a formal and rigorous annual performance evaluation of the board, its committees, and individual directors. Wow, that's quite a bit. So it's, first of all, it's annual, it's the board, its committees, and individual directors. Actually, Simon Osborne, he's not on the call today because he's conducting actually a board evaluation right now. That's a pretty intensive exercise. But why are we doing that? We're not doing that just to penalize people. There's a reason for it. It's really to understand, do we have the proper set of skills and composition in the board? That's number one. Do we also have the right diversity and effectiveness? And it's really in order to learn lessons and improve actually board composition more than it is to penalize individual people and so on. Of course, unless they have done something unethical, which would not be acceptable. But it's also about succession planning. In some countries, there are limitations as to how long you can serve on a board. And as a result, we have to make sure that with succession planning, we anticipate when someone could retire from a board, and that we have in the pipeline potential new directors in order to make sure that we keep that right balance of skills and the proper composition of the boards. Of course, it's also used in order to identify potential development needs of individual board members. And out of that could become a recommendation in order for board members to, well, follow certain types of training. And as a professor, I really appreciate lifelong learning. So I will never stop learning. So, but is that something that in a fast-paced environment is necessarily shared by most people? And I would argue not necessarily. So finally, we come to COMP, compensation, or what is in the United Kingdom called remuneration of directors. And here we have our two final principles. And the first one is that the board should have a formal and transparent procedure for developing policies on director and executive remuneration. Equally important is that no director should be involved in deciding his or her own remuneration. Otherwise, it would be much higher in most cases. And then 13, the last principle, the board should ensure that the remuneration policies and practices are designed to support strategy and are aligned with the long-term interest of the company. So they should be high enough in order to motivate people, yet not high enough that people would start looking too much at the short term and be mercantilist, so to speak. In the US, typically, remuneration practices are way higher than in the United Kingdom. And is that always justified? Why should someone, a chief executive, have a package of 30 to 40 million, including, for example, well, bonuses, but also stock options? In order to preserve independence, and that's as part of our guidance document, we also argue that independent directors, non-executive directors, should not receive any stock options or bonuses. And this is in order to help preserve their independence. In the United States, that's not always the case. In the United Kingdom, that's typically the norm. And in this case, we prefer that to be the norm for us as well. So that's the principles, but now we need to talk about applicability, and also that we have used the apply and explain principle. So where would the principles be applied to? First of all, it's not initially the entire AIFC, and George Littlejohn said, well, we need to keep in mind that this is a journey. We have started the journey, and it will take some time to actually travel that journey. So we should start somewhere, we should incubate, and then branch out to other parts of the organization. So the principles and its guidance are applicable and on an opt-in basis, in full or in part, to the AIFC authority and its 100% owned subsidiaries, and subject to approval by the AIFC authority board. Now, let me try to explain what we mean with opt-in basis. So we have 13 principles, we have 47 guidance provisions, and with the two boards I'm currently working with, we'll be going over each and every of those 47 guidance principles. Let me give an example. So one is obviously the BCPD. BCPD is what, 30 people, let's say a few $1 million in turnover. So a small organization. We provide training services in a variety of fields. Do we have a separate audit committee? The answer is, in our case, no. And then the question is, should we have one? And I would also argue, in our case, no. Does that mean that we should not look at reporting and matters reserved to the audit function? And the answer is also no. But it's at the BCPD, it's looked at the entire board level. So we don't have any separate committees, but the board looks at all the different aspects that are relevant in order for its board members to discharge their duties, including compliance, reporting, and audit. Why did we look at the AI? Well, and as another example, the AIFC authority itself does have an audit committee. Because of its size and complexity, it makes sense to have a separate audit committee. And that, of course, was a decision made by the board, the AIFC authority board itself. but I'm not aware of any AIFC authority 100% owned subsidiary that actually has its own audit committee. Over time, if we grow in terms of complexity and scale, the BCPD could very well create an audit committee, but currently we don't have. And that's what we mean with opt-in, in full or in part. But once we have opted in, what we then use is the apply and explain. And the apply explain is a relatively new phenomena. It's used in, for example, South Africa, but in the United Kingdom, it is recommended for large private companies. So not for publicly traded companies, but for large private companies. That could be, for example, a management consulting firm, but of a certain size and complexity that would require the need to have a proper corporate governance code. And there the apply and explain would prevail. So what does that mean? Once you have opted in into a certain provision and a principle, you apply the principle and explain how the principle has been applied. And that we would like to see then, of course, in the annual report as part of narrative reporting, how the principles have been applied and the explanation of how it has been applied. So applicability, apply and explain. Again, we made in order to make it contextual, given that we don't have large publicly traded companies yet. We hope to have them in the future. But right now, we have to focus on what is relevant for the AIFC and, well, and in the future also for Kazakhstan. Two more parts, and actually these parts will go a little bit faster. Training and certification and the journey ahead. So let me start with training and certification. And we are creating a corporate governance institute, ACGI, we call it. Everything at the AIFC starts with A, or most of it, like AFSA, Standard Financial Services Authority, and other examples exist. We want to do four things. We want to promote, we want to encourage, we want to train, we want to certify. So let me start with promote. So the first is that we want to promote high quality governance, corporate governance in the AIFC. I would argue it's not limited to the AIFC. We're in talks right now with companies outside of the AIFC that said, well, we are interested in your corporate governance principles. Could we have discussions about them? And also, could you provide training in corporate governance? And obviously, we will provide those services to them. And actually, that's our ultimate objective, that we incubate within the AIFC, but that hopefully over time, by promoting the high quality corporate governance in the AIFC, it branches out to other entities within Kazakhstan and even within the region. Then number two is encourage the proper application of the principles. And that really requires for us as the ACGI to lie in the trenches with boards. And very often the members of the board are not yet, I say emphasis is on yet, not yet very well trained nor experienced with corporate governance. So we need to line the trenches with them in order to work shoulder to shoulder to see how the principles can be applied, and so that they have much better corporate governance in place, but also, again, to allow directors to discharge their duties and act in the long-term interest of their companies. We're also going to provide corporate governance training, and I have a totally separate slide on that one. So I will park it in a minute, but first of all, I want to mention that it's not just corporate governance training for the AIFC. Obviously, we're already doing certain things in corporate governance training with the AIFC and its staff, but it's also outside of the AIFC, whoever is interested. And then finally, we want to have certificates of good corporate governance. It was suggested at the time by some of the working group members that we would have certificates of compliance. And we said, no, we don't want to have a compliance focus. We want to have, first of all, we want to make sure that before you can police, actually, you first have to change the mindsets. You first have to encourage people to develop, but also to adopt good principles of corporate governance. So we want to award people. It's more the carrot than actually is the stick. Over time, we will have a focus on compliance, but right now, we are not ready for it, and our organizations are not ready for that either. Corporate governance training, almost there. And you probably see some famous brand names on this one. And Simon Haslam, he's actually with Dr. Simon Haslam, who is on our call here. He is obviously with the IOD, the Institute of Directors, and he's going to be serving on our panel as well during Astana Finance Days. So the first one that we have here is we're going to have two things. That is for executive leadership and the level just below. So we're talking about at the AIFC, the top 30, and then the next 60. And there we're going to have a 2-hour session, and that will be done by Simon Osborne, the former Chief Executive of the Chartered Governance Institute. And that's going to be on the value of good governance. And he's going to present a few things. He has developed a paper around it. And then it's going to be an open debate about what does that really mean for you. And then secondly is leadership for directors, which is one of the 4 modules that is part of the certificate of the IOD, the Institute of Directors, and Simon Haslam will be teaching that. And that is again for the same segment, top 30, and then also the next 60 within the AIFC. Then we have a governance leadership program. And this is a design program. It's designed by Carl George, Simon Osborne, and myself. And it's a masterclass. We're thinking currently about 4 days. And hopefully it will lead to a certification. It will focus on all the important matters at least an introductory level and it's designed for board members, existing or future aspiring board members. Then we have through the BCPD, we have made an agreement with ICSA, the Chartered Governance Institute, to offer the Chartered Governance Professional Program. So this is a chartered program. It consists of 7 modules. Each module, the estimate is about 200 hours of study. Would take about 2 years to complete. If people are very committed about it, I would say more realistically 3 years to complete. We will start with the fast track, and the fast track is designed for accountants, chartered accountants of one of 4 bodies. That's typically the British bodies and also the Scottish body. And then they are able to fast track, and that means they only have to take 2 modules, which is corporate governance and risk management, instead of 7 modules. And it's also for lawyers, and I kept it for the last because I think quite a few of you are lawyers. There's one requirement for you to be fast track. You also have to be associated with your local bar here in Kazakhstan. So if you're a lawyer and you're associated with your local bar, then actually you can be fast tracked, and with 2 modules, you can actually become a chartered governance professional. And then you can use the designation FCG behind your name. Then finally, what we will do is also webinars and conferences. Today is a webinar. I'm presenting way too much. I should be getting questions, but they're not coming in. So please fire your questions to me, but also later on, we will still have about 10 minutes for Q&A if people want to speak up. But we will have webinars and conferences. And then finally, the journey ahead is really about what I have mentioned already before, but it's now laid out over a period of 2 years. I see here a question from my colleague, Alibek Nurbekov, how the corona crisis being deeper and wider in its nature compared to the two. They won't affect the corporate governance principles. And it will definitely not lead to a corporate governance 5.0. Now, first of all, let me explain a little bit the difference between a wild card, or what some people call a black swan, and on the other hand, a gray rhino. So what do you think the pandemic is? Could it have been anticipated or not? What do you think? And was it anticipated? I don't see anybody. Alibek Nurbekov says yes. Alibek, you followed my course on scenario planning. I'm sorry, you should know better, because the answer is no. This cannot be anticipated, nor in time, nor in space. This is what we call a crisis that suddenly emerges without any weak signals. There were no weak signals, zero. Now that the pandemic is there, we can develop scenarios, and actually we did. And we're going to have 2 panels that actually, during Astana Finance Days, that actually look at these scenarios, and they will be taking place on the 29th. The same is true, like, let's say, the same is true, let me finish this and then I will go to Almas. The same is true with, let's say, Fukushima. And Lady Barbara Judge actually was part of a commission, I think she even chaired that commission, to evaluate the causes and consequences of Fukushima. Again, Fukushima, its cause could not have been anticipated, nor in time, nor in space. So the question is, what do you as a company do in the face of a global pandemic? Or let's also look at BP, for example, Macondo. What do? You develop contingency plan. And a contingency plan allows you to be operationally ready to mitigate the consequences of that a shock like this would devastating you quite significantly. With scenarios, on the other hand, like for example, with the global financial economic crisis, the objective is all about not to be blindsided. Anticipate future discontinuities so that ideally you can avoid them, prevent them from happening, or also that you would create strategic options that you can turn an uncertainty into a benefit. I'm looking here at why should corporate governance matter to SMEs? Is corporate governance costly for them? It matters for all companies. And actually, SMEs even have reporting requirements. My own small company, I have reporting requirements. They're limited, of course. Is corporate governance costly for them? I would argue it's not costly. It requires more time than actually money. But it's important to look at what really matters for you, and look at well, what are the actions I would take, in this case probably as an executive director, who at the same time would be probably the chairman of the board as well, like is the case for my company. But I would be looking at the long-term success of my own company. So it's not necessarily costly. And does it matter to them? 100%. Corporate governance is should be part of every single company. can be applied in Kazakhstan companies? Well, first of all, we didn't develop a code, we developed a number of principles. So principles give dramatic flexibility in order to apply the principles to your own circumstances. And that's why we decided to develop principles. And I would say it can be applied to any company in Kazakhstan. And I would suggest that if you have a company that would be interested, is that we would look at the guidance document and see what is applicable given the size and complexity of my organization in order to promote good corporate governance. There's another question here from Carl George. Do you see any corporate governance response required with the latest pandemic? Oh, yes, and George Floyd. Wow, Carl, this is a very tough question. I studied in the US, and I think my wife is on the call as well, by the way. And I always, and she's American, and I said to her that, well, US is a country of extremes in every regard. And I really still believe that. And now with George Floyd, it's even more the case. The corporate governance tackles corporate responsibility, diversity, inclusion, and transparency, as well as sustainability. Well, yes, it does, but how many companies have already really looked at that? And I think we still have a long way to go, especially in the United States. I think there's too much of a focus on growing the size of the pie in the short term in the United States, then growing the size of the pie in the long term, and at the same time making sure that the diverse stakeholders get a fair share of the pie. And I think what we will need in the future with sustainable corporate governance, we also will need to have something like sustainable and more inclusive capitalism. I'm not one to go away from capitalism, but it goes hand in hand, sustainable capitalism and sustainable corporate governance, I would argue. And when something is more sustainable, it would be more inclusive and it would be more resilient as well. I see here from Alexei, how do AIFC corporate governance standards apply to emerging markets? Well, the principles apply to companies, and we have with the flexibility, let me go back to that slide, of the applicability, opt-in in full or in part, and the apply and explain. It can be, in principle, applied to any company of any size. But really the question is, what is applicable to me as a company, and what is not applicable, and as a result, what should I then focus on as a company director and as a board, but also how could that change over time? And so indeed, I think that we have a lot of flexibility in the way that we have not only designed and articulated the principles, but also in the way that we have articulated the applicability and the principle of apply and explain. No more questions? I need a drink. What is this? Oh, coffee. It's still too early for something else. Sorry. Yes, Carl is just saying something. You can probably read it as well, but let me read it out loud. Thank you, I agree. Performance must be measured not just on return to shareholders, but also impact on environment, social, and governance. 100%, Carl, 100%. We're a long way from that still, unfortunately. And you as a governance professional and educator, you can help promote this quite dramatically. And I'm happy that we have quite a number of educators as well here, like Simon Osborne already referred to, Carl George as well. And I know that you are working with company directors and with boards. And by doing so, you help promote sound corporate governance norms and behaviors, and also help change the mindsets that exist. And I would say mindsets are very, very important. I see here how corporate governance helps to minimize the risk and how can we manage them. Well, remember the fundamental relationship between risk and return. So the first thing is that boards need to set the risk appetite, and that risk appetite need to be relevant given, well, size, complexity, environment in which the company is operating. That's number one. Number two is that a company, and for example, at the BCPD, we spent at the beginning, no, it was last year, and a little bit at the beginning of this year, we did our first risk identification mapping, and also we came up with mitigation strategies. Now, not all risks can be mitigated. Sometimes you have to accept the risks. Especially when the risks are outside of your control. But also, when risks are outside of your control, then the question is, should you design your portfolio of activities in such a way that, that in fact, you would not be exposed to that risk anymore, or that your exposure would be reduced? Kazakhstan as a country, for example, is highly exposed to a particular uncertainty that is entirely outside of its control, and that's actually commodity prices. When commodity prices are high, what happens is money is coming in. When commodity prices are low, we cut in our own budget. So maybe what we should be thinking about is, how do we diversify the economy away in order to be less affected by those uncertainties and risks, and as a result, turn an uncertainty in an opportunity. What value can an independent director bring to my company? How do I trust independent directors with confidential information? Well, you obviously, an independent director will bring a different perspective. Of course, you have to carefully select and not just take a director from your network or your circle of friends. But depending on your company and the challenges and opportunities it faces, you may want to bring in a director, an independent director, that brings a skill set and challenge to the debate that otherwise you would not get from within the organization, or from, let's say, in a family business. In a family business, increasingly, they bring in independent directors in order to challenge the family members, in order to, well, make better and decisions over time. CAS function of board, mostly in CAS, is just nominal approve or not approve executive body's decision. I'm not 100% sure I understand. Well, okay, yes, I think I know what you mean, yes. I'm not going to use names, but I have seen people that, first of all, never show up for board meetings. That's number one. But can't do anything about it, right? Because well, they have been nominated to a board, but they don't discharge their duties as a result. So what we really want to do is, we want to make sure that we have proper composition and structure at board, so that we can really have a debate that challenges mental models. And as a result, what comes out of it is dramatically better decisions. Otherwise, don't be on a board. Being on a board is not a badge of honor. Being on a board comes with dramatic responsibility, not just to the shareholders, but to the long-term success of the company. And as a result, I to some degree, I highlight the value of good governance. Companies that are properly governed are able to dramatically better navigate uncertainty over time, and they make better decisions. And remuneration principles provided are too vague. Well, the principles, maybe yes, but the guidance documents gives actually quite a long description of what we do mean with remuneration principles. It's a fair point, Altin Beck. The principle itself is pretty high level, but the principle would never be used without its guidance document. So they go hand in hand. All right, 1730 over here, diversity on board. This is the last question I will answer. The rest we can indeed do via email. You mentioned about diversity at the board. How do you think about diversity of board in terms of ethnicity and religion? Well, they all contribute, but they all have to come together. Ethnicity, gender, religion, they all have to come together in a way that you're going to have thought diversity. I would say thought diversity is in the center, and it's driven by a broad perspectives that can come from religion, can come from ethnicity, can come from culture, can come from educational background, and so on.
Okay.
Yes, okay, there's one more question. Let me answer that too. And the answer is yes. All the chartered governance bodies have continuous professional development as a requirement in order to keep your charter. And they provide a variety of ways in order to do that, and to keep the right balance of skills and current among directors. Almas, you were saying?
Yeah, Professor, thank you. So one more raised hand here, maybe the last question from the audience. So I'm turning on the mic, please.
So I was going to ask the question to the professor. This is Lady Barbara Judge. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you very well, Lady Barbara Judge.
So firstly, I want to thank you, Professor, for giving us such a very thoughtful discussion of corporate governance and how we have it in the world today, and particularly in Kazakhstan and in the Astana Financial Center. And second of all, I would like to suggest that we are all very fortunate to have had that benefit of your wisdom today, especially as we're all going to be at the Astana Finance Days in July. Mm-hmm. My one last question to you, and it's an easy question, is when do you think we can all be together again to discuss your principles in person?
Aha. It's not an easy question, actually, Lady Barbara Judge. So,
well, not easy, short. Maybe it isn't easy, but it's short.
Well, what I will do, I will send you a narrative, and I'm happy to send the narrative will become available very quickly on the website of Astana Finance Days. But I will send you a narrative in a minute after the discussion ends. We developed scenarios, and we developed scenarios on when we knew that the pandemic was unfolding, and we developed 3 scenarios. One is managed crises, and the other one is a double whammy, and the final one, which is definitely one we don't want to see materializing, is what we call pandemic 2.0. So your question really depends on which scenario is going to be playing out. And it depends on 2 broad factors. One is global coordination, and the other one is local government response. In the case of managed crises, we would see that the pandemic probably ends around the spring of next year, when also at that time a vaccine would be universally available. And in pandemic, in Depression 2.0, we're talking about potentially heading into 2023. I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's the kind of beast we're dealing with this global pandemic, unfortunately. So I hope to see you in person in London or here around the spring of next year. And just looking at, because what we're doing, we're tracking also in which direction we're going. We're still closer to managed crises than to any of the two other scenarios. But time will tell, and especially we will know more now that economies are opening up, whether potentially we would have a second wave, and as a result, potentially a double whammy emerging. And I really hope that won't be the case, but also what is unfortunately also a factor that plays in here is that over time, people become less resilient and they start taking more decisions for themselves and progressively more risk as well. That's a human factor that also we have taken into account when we developed the scenarios. So my answer is, I hope in the spring of next year, but that would be really at the earliest, I would say.
Well, I look forward to then, if not before, and speak to you tomorrow again. Thank you so much.
Thank you indeed, Lady Barbara Judge. And one last point of publicity, and that is on Friday, I believe it's the 3rd of June, we will have a panel on the AIFC Corporate Governance Principles. I won't be presenting anything. We're going to have a debate. Lady Barbara Judge will be on there. George Littlejohn, Carl George, who is also on the call here, Dr. Simon Haslam, and who am I missing? Simon Osborne. And I promise you, it's going to be a fascinating discussion because you're going to be learning from the best. So thank you very much for participating. And if you have any other questions, please do send them to me in writing. I will try to address them.
Professor van der Putte, on behalf of the AIFC Academy of Law, we are extremely grateful for your presentation today. Very insightful, very relevant. We look forward to following up. As you were going through your discussion, I was thinking about all the various implications for lawyers and other members of the legal industry. And starting with developing governance principles and guidance notes, educating employees, boards, and so forth, instituting compliance processes for companies, and then what happens if things go wrong? What about non-compliance, where non-compliance with policies and guidance notes may cause risks of harm to the company, to shareholders, suppliers, customers, and so forth? Well, what are the rights and remedies that those aggrieved parties might have? And what, as a lawyer, should we know about how to handle those cases? What about the other side? What if there's an alleged non-compliance with governance principles and a board member comes to you as a lawyer and says, I need to defend myself. Here's what happened. What do I do next? So there will be more to come from the Academy of Law around the legal implications arising from governance principles, policies, procedures, and so forth. So we very much look forward to that. This is very much a topic where there is an intersection and in fact an integration between business and law. So these are the types of topics that we'll be tackling in the near future. Professor, thank you so much again. And thanks to our audience members who participated in today's event. Have a great day. Have a terrific weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and to all the participants. You all stayed online. How is it possible? Listening to me for an hour and a half. Personally, I would not have done it. Kudos to all of you and look forward to seeing you soon. And thanks again for attending. Take care and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.